How far would you go for a wild animal that asked for help? That question, the kind that rattles around in your mind late at night, became real for Laura Miller on a fading summer evening, somewhere deep in the silent woods of Montana. Laura, a nurse on sabbatical after the kind of personal tragedy that drains every room of light, had retreated to a cabin meant for healing, not heroics. She told herself she came for the solitude, the whisper of pine needles, the wind rattling the screen door. But on this particular evening, it felt more like hiding. As dusk folded over the trees, Laura stood at her kitchen sink, hands immersed in cool water, the kind of mindless chore she had come to rely on to keep the memories at bay. That's when she heard it, a sound that split the hush, raw and sharp, not quite a scream, not quite a cry, but full of pleading. Her hands stilled. The noise came again, and it wasn't far. A kind of keening she'd only heard once before, years ago, when a fox kit had been caught in a fence. Her heart kicked up. In Montana, the wild is always watching. Sometimes it calls, sometimes it warns. Tonight, it sounded like it was begging. Laura moved to the back door and eased it open. The chill of dusk greeted her, tinged with wood smoke and the electric smell of rain that always seemed about to break. She stepped out onto the porch. The yard, once an orderly patch of grass, was now wild with weeds and shadows. Then she saw it. Just beyond the porch light's weak reach, two shapes moved in the failing light. One, large, mottled, unmistakably feline, dragged something small, limp, and bloodied behind it. Laura's breath caught. A bobcat. She recognized the size and the wild, wary grace. But it was the eyes that pinned her in place. Not predatory, not triumphant, but desperate. The bobcat stopped at the edge of the yard, hackles high, ears flattened, tail lashing, a coiled wire of fear and defiance. Laura stood rooted, every nerve ending screaming at her to go back inside, to respect the boundary between wild and human. But the wild cat didn't snarl or run. Instead, she nudged the tiny form with her nose almost tender, as if urging it forward. The limp body gave a tiny, shuddering twitch. Laura saw a kitten, a bobcat cub, hardly bigger than her hand, slick with blood and dust. Its chest rose and fell in shallow, broken jerks. Laura's own hands trembled. Her training as a nurse warred with every warning bell in her head. This is not your place. This is not your fight. You can't help. But the mother's eyes held hers, wide and unblinking. In that impossible moment, Laura felt something pass between them, a plea that didn't need words, a kind of trust so fragile it might break if she even breathed too loudly. Laura crouched slowly, arms extended, palms open. "It's okay," she whispered, voice barely above the wind. The bobcat flinched but didn't retreat. Instead, she nudged the cub again, closer now, until it lay between them, closer to Laura than to her. Then, with a final, searching look, the mother bobcat retreated a few steps, crouching just at the tree line, her golden eyes never leaving Laura. For a heartbeat, the world stilled. Only Laura's pulse pounded in her ears. She inched forward, fighting her own panic. Every part of her wanted to turn away, but she kept her focus on the cub. She saw torn fur, a wound on its flank that looked too deep for a kitten so small, blood matting the side of its face. Its breathing came in quick, whistling gasps, mouth open, tongue lolling. It needed help now, or it wouldn't see the morning. Her hands hovered above the tiny body, uncertain, then settled, gentle but determined. She remembered every emergency she'd faced as a nurse, the nights she'd worked through exhaustion and doubt, the lives she'd lost, the ones she'd saved. The difference had always been action, however small, however scared she was. The cub mewled, a broken, pleading sound. Laura wrapped it in her jacket, feeling the shiver of its body against her chest. She backed up, moving slow, careful not to trigger the mother's fear. The bobcat crept forward one step, then stopped, tension singing in every muscle. Laura hesitated. She glanced back. The mother bobcat's eyes met hers, fierce, proud, and impossibly trusting. With one last look at the wild mother, Laura slipped through her door, clutching the cub to her chest, her heart pounding like it might burst. Inside, the warmth of the kitchen felt foreign. She set the tiny animal on the counter and saw the life draining out of it, second by second. Her hands shook as she grabbed towels, her emergency kit, every bit of knowledge she'd ever stored away for moments like this. But this was nothing like any moment before. This was the edge, the boundary between wild and human, life and death, courage and fear. If she failed, no one would ever know. But if she did nothing, the cub would die, and that wild, impossible trust would die with it. Laura pressed her palms to the countertop, breathing hard. In the window's reflection, she saw her own eyes, tired, hollow, but determined. She made her choice, as darkness gathered outside, and the bobcat mother paced the yard. Laura Miller reached for her medical bag and prepared to fight for a life she was never meant to touch. And so began the longest night of her life. The night pressed in around the cabin, thick as wool, broken only by the rhythmic rasp of Laura's breath and the distant, restless pacing outside. She could feel the mother bobcat out there, a living shadow, watchful, waiting, wild eyes burning through the glass. Every instinct told Laura to lock the doors, turn off the lights, pretend this wasn't happening. Instead, she was hunched over the battered kitten on her kitchen table, the last flicker of sunlight bleeding away behind the mountains. Scout. The name came to her as she gently cleaned the wounds on his tiny body, dabbing with trembling hands at the dirt and blood. He looked more like a scrap of rag than a creature meant for the wild, a broken thing, shivering and silent. Scout, she whispered, as if naming him might anchor him to this world. Her mind raced with a nurse's cold logic. Check pulse, weak, thready, breathing, shallow, irregular. The gash on his flank wasn't the only injury. A ragged ear, a bruised rib. Bite marks? Had something attacked them out there in the woods? She imagined the mother's frantic dash through the dusk, fleeing coyotes or an owl. Laura's throat tightened. Her training was both a blessing and a curse. She knew how to help, yes, but also exactly how much could go wrong. Am I helping or interfering? The question gnawed at her. Wild animals carried their own codes, their own fates. Humans weren't meant to cross this line, but the image of the bobcat mother's eyes, pleading, unafraid, burned in her memory. If she did nothing, Scout would be gone before dawn. She cranked up the old oil heater and wrapped Scout in a towel, warming him against her chest. The house was quiet, save for the click of her phone as she scrolled through wildlife forums, desperate for advice. Kitten shock recovery, bobcat cub first aid, emergency fluids, small mammals. Most posts were about house cats, indoor kittens, with names like Muffin and Daisy. Nothing about wild ones. No guide for a night like this. Still, she tried. Laura found her bag of veterinary supplies, leftovers from volunteering at the shelter back home. Syringes, saline, a tiny needle she'd sterilized 100 times before. She fumbled, hands sweaty, as she measured out a dose of fluids, whispering, "Just a little. Hang on, Scout, please." The needle slipped beneath the fragile skin at his scruff, a move she'd done for years on house pets, but never like this. Never with a life that seemed to flicker beneath her fingers. Outside, the Bobcat mother's silhouette appeared at the edge of the porch. Laura felt the wildness pressing in, raw, alive, unknowable. The two of them, mother and nurse, both helpless in their own ways, she pressed a warm compress to Scout's side and listened for the slightest change in his breathing. Minutes passed. Then an hour. The wind picked up, rattling the old windows, and Laura's mind played tricks. She imagined eyes in every shadow, imagined the sound of car tires on gravel, a ranger's flashlight slicing through the night. What would she even say if someone came? "Yes, officer. I'm caring for a wild bobcat cub, because his mother trusted me." It sounded crazy even to her own ears. Guilt gnawed at her. She shouldn't have brought Scout inside. What if her human smell doomed him in the wild? What if she was only drawing out his suffering? She'd seen it before. Good intentions gone bad. But still, every time Scout's chest rose, just a little stronger, she clung to hope. Exhaustion pulled at her. She tried to drink coffee, but her stomach twisted. She texted her old friend, Dr. Kelly, but didn't hit send. Too much to explain. Too risky. Outside, a branch snapped. The bobcat paced, tail lashing, moonlight glinting off her fur. She could bolt at any moment, but she stayed. The wild mother was a constant presence, unafraid, unspeakably patient. Laura checked Scout's temperature, wincing at how low it was. She microwaved a sock filled with rice and tucked it beside him, a makeshift heating pad. "Come on, little guy," she murmured. "Just make it till morning." She forced a dropper of goat milk between his lips, praying he'd swallow. He sputtered, then gulped weakly. It wasn't enough. The night dragged on. Laura's eyes burned from staring at the screen, reading every horror story and hopeful post about wild animal rescue. Half the advice said to leave him outside and let nature take its course. The other half insisted on medical care, warmth, fluids. "You're not supposed to get attached," she told herself. But every tiny sigh Scout made, every twitch of his paws, tied her tighter to him. Suddenly, Scout's body arched. He convulsed, a sharp electric spasm. Laura's heart seized. She grabbed him, holding tight as his breath came ragged and short. "No, no, no, stay with me!" His head lolled, eyes rolling back, a wet gasp rattling in his throat. Laura's hands flew to the medical bag, fumbling for anything, anything at all, to save him. She tried mouth-to-nose breaths, just as she'd seen done with kittens in the ER. The world shrank to the size of her hands and the fading life beneath them. Outside, the bobcat mother yowled, a low, guttural cry that sent chills down Laura's spine. Minutes felt like years. Scout's breathing slowed, then steadied, faint but there. Laura pressed her forehead to the table, shaking. She whispered a promise to the wild, to the dark, to herself. "I won't give up on him. I won't." But as the hours slipped by, the stakes of her choice pressed down harder. If Scout didn't make it to dawn, she'd have to face the mother outside, empty-handed, helpless, and haunted by the risk she'd taken. And if he did, what then? A pale light grew in the east, and Laura forced herself to keep watch, heart pounding. She stroked Scout's battered fur, eyes never leaving his tiny chest, praying each breath would not be his last. And so the long night of uncertainty stretched on, neither human nor wild, suspended between hope and heartbreak, with only trust to guide them through the dark. Night pressed against the cabin like a living thing, cold and infinite, swallowing sound and distance. Laura sat curled in an old armchair she'd dragged beside the kitchen table, the battered kitten, Scout, cradled in a nest of towels and hope. A single lamp burned, its circle of light trembling over the room. Each minute stretched, taut as a piano wire, threatening to snap. She didn't dare let herself sleep. Every hour, sometimes less, Laura woke, heart pounding, skin chilled, straining to hear the faint rasp of Scout's breath. Each time she pressed a trembling hand to his tiny ribs, searching for the rise and fall, the stubborn flutter of life beneath battered fur. When his chest moved, she exhaled, body melting into momentary relief. When his breathing hitched, or he whimpered in his sleep, fear snapped her awake, nerves on fire. Outside, the world was all silver and shadow. She glimpsed the bobcat mother moving between tree trunks, low and silent. Occasionally, the cat's eyes caught the moonlight, two burning coins at the edge of the dark. Never closer, never farther, always watching. Time lost all meaning. The heater hummed, clicking as it cycled off and on. Laura heated a damp washcloth, stroked Scout's head, coaxed sips of goat milk into his reluctant mouth. When the wind picked up, the house groaned and flexed, and Laura remembered she was utterly alone. No one knew she was here, no one but the wild. At first, Laura's thoughts chased themselves in anxious circles, calculating vital signs, replaying every moment of first aid, cataloging what supplies she still had left. But as the hours trickled by, those thoughts faded, replaced by memories, the kind that came unbidden, ghost-like. Her mother's voice echoed, gentle but firm. "You can't save everything, Laura, but you try anyway, because that's who you are." The memory stung. Her mother had been a nurse, too. Laura saw her now, strong hands, tired eyes, sitting up late in their old house, watching over Laura through childhood fevers and teenage heartbreak. Laura hadn't meant to follow in her footsteps. It just happened, the same way rivers follow valleys. She blinked back tears, angry at herself for growing so soft, so easily moved by a wild animal's need. Grief had hollowed her out in the months since her mother's death, left her wandering, uncertain, brittle. She'd run to Montana to escape the noise of city life, the pitying looks, the endless reminders that everything familiar was now missing. Now, in this wilderness, loss had found her anyway, transformed in the form of a dying kitten, and a mother who refused to leave. Hours passed. Scout slept, occasionally twitching, sometimes mewling in pain. Laura sang lullabies under her breath, the words drifting out of her, learned long ago, surprising her with their gentleness. The kind of song meant for children and lost things. Between checks on Scout, Laura drifted in and out of shallow sleep. Each time she woke, she peered through the window, searching for the bobcat mother. She was always there, sometimes pacing, sometimes crouched low to the ground, a patient sentry holding her post. The two of them, mother and nurse, separated by a pane of glass and 1,000 years of wildness. Sometime after midnight, Laura wrapped herself in a blanket and opened the door just a crack. Cold air sliced in. She stepped out, slippers crunching on the frosted grass. The mother bobcat froze, muscles tense but didn't run. For a long moment, Laura stood there, breathing in the night, feeling the wild mother's gaze settle on her. She whispered, "I'm trying. I swear I'm trying." The bobcat tilted her head, ears flicking. She was beautiful in the half-light, scarred, powerful, impossibly alive. Laura felt a pulse of something like gratitude or awe, or maybe just the overwhelming loneliness of two creatures, both desperate to save what they loved. Inside again, Laura checked Scout's wounds. His fever still hovered dangerously high. She changed the towels, massaged his paws to keep the blood moving, read another dozen forum threads about orphaned wildlife. The screen's blue glow flickered over her face. "Don't interfere," they said. "Let nature run its course." But nature had brought the wild to her door, and she couldn't look away. The world outside grew quieter, the forest settling into its deepest dark. Coyotes yipped far off. An owl called 3 times. Laura dozed in her chair, waking at every sigh, every shift in Scout's breath. Dreams drifted in. Her mother's hands, warm and steady. The weight of old sorrow, the hope of small, impossible miracles. Sometime before dawn, she woke with a start. Scout was still, too still. For a moment, Laura's heart seized. Then his body shuddered, his mouth opening in a thin, pitiful mew. Relief flooded her, raw, fierce. She pressed a trembling kiss to his head, promising nothing except that she'd keep trying, no matter the hour, no matter how thin the line between hope and heartbreak had become. Through it all, the silent company of the wild mother watched over them, and as the first pale hints of dawn crept through the trees, Laura realized she was not as alone as she thought. The wild, it seemed, kept its own vigil. In that long, restless night, something invisible passed between woman and Bobcat, an unspoken agreement. They would both hold on, for as long as it took, for the sake of a fragile, battered life that refused to give up. A pale wash of dawn crept through the frosted windows, painting the kitchen in shades of blue and gold. For the first time in hours, Laura allowed herself to hope. Scout, the battered Bobcat kitten, lay curled in her lap, his breathing slow and measured, but no longer a desperate rasp. The fever that had haunted him through the night had finally broken just before sunrise. Laura had felt it in the coolness of his tiny paws, the faint pulse steadier beneath her fingertips. She let her head rest against the back of the chair, bone-tired but alert. The wild mother lingered outside, a silent shadow in the mist, unmoving except for the occasional flick of her ears. In the gray light, Laura could see the powerful lines of the bobcat's body, the battered edge of one ear, the muscles beneath her spotted coat. Their unspoken bond felt almost physical now, an invisible thread running from Laura's chest to the wild mother's, pulling them together across the fragile barrier of glass and instinct. Scout stirred, his eyes fluttering open. For a heartbeat, the wild yellow-green gaze fixed on Laura's face. There was no fear, only the dazed confusion of a creature too small to understand the boundaries it had crossed. His mew was thin, plaintive. Laura's heart squeezed. "You're a fighter, little guy," she whispered, stroking his head with infinite care. Feeding him was an ordeal, but this time Scout swallowed the goat milk from the dropper with a little more strength, lapping at the warm liquid, until his tongue flicked out in an exhausted sigh. His entire body fit in the palm of Laura's hand. She cradled him there, feeling his bones, his warmth, his wildness, a fragile thing that somehow seemed to pulse with hope. As the sun rose higher, Laura found herself fighting an internal battle. Every instinct from her training screamed at her not to get attached. "He's a wild animal. He belongs out there, not in here. Don't make him tame. Don't make him love you. It'll only make it harder for him to survive." But every time Scout reached for her with a tiny paw, every time his gaze sought her face in the quiet morning, she felt her resolve crumbling. Outside, the wild mother's patience was a lesson all its own. She did not scratch at the door or yowl with anger. Instead, she watched. When Laura opened the back door to change the towels and shake out the kitchen rug, the bobcat remained poised at the tree line, muscles tensed but unmoving. Laura ventured a few feet onto the porch. The air was cold, scented with pine and the last hints of night. She left a small bowl of water at the edge of the steps, a peace offering, or perhaps a gesture of trust. The bobcat's eyes met hers, ancient and unreadable. Inside, Laura tended to Scout, but she also found herself tending to wounds of her own. The act of care, slow, deliberate, attentive, became its own medicine. Her hands remembered how to comfort, how to heal. The loss of her mother, the grief that had made her a ghost in her own life, felt lighter, if only for a moment. The day moved in a strange rhythm. Laura moved between windows, always checking for the mother's presence. She researched bobcat behavior, nursing methods, wildlife rehabilitation on her phone, scribbling notes in the margin of a tattered notebook. She worried about disease, about Scout growing too dependent, about the authorities, about everything that could go wrong. But every so often she stopped worrying and just watched. Scout slept on her lap, his tiny chest rising and falling, a soft vibration of life she could feel against her skin. She marveled at how quickly she had come to love him, not as a pet, but as something wilder, more sacred. The bond between them was wordless, pure, and desperately fragile. As afternoon light angled through the kitchen, Scout awoke, stronger now, and stretched awkwardly. He climbed Laura's shirt with tiny claws, kneading into her chest the way all kittens do when they remember their mothers. Laura laughed, a sound she hadn't made in weeks, startled by the sheer joy of it. She whispered, "You're going to make it, aren't you?" Scout answered with a soft, questioning chirp. But always, underneath the joy, a thread of sadness ran. Laura knew that Scout did not belong to her, no matter how much her heart wished otherwise. He belonged to the wild mother pacing just beyond reach, and to the wind and the trees and the night. The time would come soon when she would have to let him go. The very act of saving him would mean giving him back. That realization brought its own kind of pain, a sweetness and a sorrow, tightly woven. Laura remembered her mother's last words. Don't close yourself off, even when it hurts. Let yourself care. Let yourself love. That's what keeps you human. Maybe, Laura thought, she was learning to be human again, in this strange, wild place. As dusk crept back across the woods, Laura sat by the window, Scout warm and soft in her lap. The bobcat mother appeared, silent and watchful, as she had every evening since the crisis began. Laura pressed her palm to the glass. The bobcat's eyes flicked to the gesture, then back to Scout. For one miraculous moment, Laura felt that the boundary between worlds was thin as a breath. She belonged to the wild as much as it belonged to her. That night, as Scout curled beside her heart, Laura realized something profound. She was no longer just saving a kitten. She was healing herself, piece by fragile piece, in the patient company of the wild. By the time the next evening set in, a subtle shift crept into the calm of Laura's days. Scout, still weak but growing steadier, had started to explore the edges of the kitchen counter under her gentle supervision, his paws tentative and unsteady. His wild mother continued her patient vigil in the shadows of the tree line, a silent presence who watched every movement through the cabin's windows. Laura, for all her exhaustion, felt a growing undercurrent of hope. She could almost imagine things ending well. That illusion shattered with a single, unexpected knock at the door. It was the sound no one expects in a place so remote. The brisk, no-nonsense rapping of knuckles on weathered wood. Laura froze in the middle of mixing powdered goat milk, every muscle tense. Scout went stiff on the towel by the window, his ears flicking back, his body pressed low as if some primal warning shot through him. Laura glanced at the door, at the window, then back at the woods, as if hoping the mother bobcat might somehow sense the danger too. The knock came again, sharper this time. She moved to the door, heart thundering. Through the peephole she glimpsed the hunched figure of her nearest neighbor, Frank Bennett, a stocky man in a battered Carhartt jacket, ball cap shadowing his eyes. He was the kind who always seemed to know everyone's business, even this far from town. Laura forced a smile and opened the door. "Evening, Frank." He didn't bother with pleasantries. His gaze darted over her shoulder, into the kitchen. "Evening, Laura. Hope I'm not bothering you, but—" He paused, eyes narrowing. "Saw a little critter in your window earlier. Not a house cat, is it?" Laura felt the world contract. She blocked the doorway a little more with her body. "Stray kitten, maybe. Just until it gets its strength back." She prayed her voice didn't shake. Frank snorted. "That's no house cat, Laura. That's a wild one. Look, I'm not trying to make trouble, but you know the rules up here. Folks find out you're harboring wildlife, especially a bobcat. Game wardens won't like that. Could be big trouble. Fines, maybe worse." His gaze flicked to the edge of the woods, and you know, that mother cat ain't going anywhere till she gets her cub back. You're asking for a mess. Laura's hands clenched behind her back. "I appreciate the concern, Frank. I'm just trying to help. He was hurt bad. If I hadn't taken him in, he'd be dead already." Frank grunted, unconvinced. "Sometimes letting nature run its course is the best way. Not everyone up here thinks like you. I'd be careful who sees what in your windows." He hesitated, almost softening. "If you need help, well, just don't let this get out of hand, all right?" She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. He tipped his hat and walked away, boots crunching in the gravel, or it watched him until he disappeared behind the trees, then shut the door, leaning against it, breath coming in shallow bursts. Inside, Scout mewled quietly, sensing her anxiety. She scooped him up, holding him close as she peered out the window. The mother bobcat remained at her post, unwavering. For the first time, Laura felt a flicker of real fear. Fear not just for herself, but for Scout, for the mother, for the fragile trust that bound them all together. That night, as Laura tried to calm her nerves, her phone vibrated with an unfamiliar number. She hesitated, then answered, her voice uncertain. On the other end, an official-sounding voice cut through the static. "Miss Miller? This is Officer Davidson with Montana Fish and Wildlife. We've received a report about a wild animal being harbored at your address. We need to speak with you regarding state regulations on wildlife custody." Laura's mouth went dry. "It's not what it sounds like. He was injured. I couldn't just leave him." The voice interrupted. "Miss Miller, I'm not making accusations. I'm advising you. If you're in possession of a wild animal, it must be reported immediately for its own welfare and yours. If that animal is a bobcat, the consequences are serious, especially if it poses any risk to you or your neighbors." She barely managed a reply before the line went dead. Her hands shook as she set the phone down, trying to steady her breathing. Scout, oblivious to the looming threat, batted weakly at the edge of her sleeve, his tiny claws snagging the fabric. A cold realization settled in. It wasn't just about Scout anymore. Her own future, the wild mother's peace, and Scout's very life were suddenly tangled in red tape and the wary eyes of neighbors. Laura sat at the kitchen table, staring at the old medical bag, the supplies, the soft towels and bowls. What if they came tomorrow? What if they took Scout away, sent him to a facility, or worse? She pictured Scout in a cage, separated from his mother, growing weaker instead of stronger, his wildness dimming under fluorescent lights. She imagined the mother bobcat's grief, her endless pacing, her calls never answered. The thought was unbearable. Outside, the wind had picked up. The forest seemed to close in, branches scraping against the window as if trying to warn her. Laura's mind raced with possibilities. Hide Scout. Move him to the shed. Sneak him out to the woods tonight and hope for the best? None of the options seemed fair. None of them seemed safe. Late into the night, Laura sat with Scout pressed against her heart, whispering apologies and half-formed promises. She found herself writing a letter to Fish and Wildlife, hands trembling as she tried to explain everything: the trust, the hope, the impossible moment when wild and human had met. But as the clock ticked toward dawn, she faced the hardest question yet. Was it better to risk everything to keep Scout safe, or to let him go before the world could take him away? Somewhere outside, the mother bobcat waited, patient and silent, a guardian of the boundary between worlds, and Laura, caught between law and love, knew that dawn would bring a choice she could no longer avoid. The next morning arrived with a heavy, bruised sky and a silence that seemed to swallow the world whole. Laura had barely slept, her mind running in circles, haunted by the officer's call and Frank's warning, by images of Scout trapped behind wire or worse, quietly erased by a system that didn't believe in small miracles. She watched the first gray light seep through her curtains and wondered if she'd ever again look at a sunrise without dread in her chest. Scout was awake early, weak but determined, his gaze meeting Laura's with a clarity that startled her. He was stronger now. His wounds were healing, and his breathing had steadied. But even as she dabbed a warm cloth along his side and coaxed him to drink, Laura knew she was living on borrowed time. Outside, the wild mother paced at the forest's edge. Her vigilance never faltered, a shadow stitched to the tree line, muscles tense and waiting. The bond between woman and wildcat had grown stronger, more complicated. Each day Scout lingered inside, Laura felt that thread stretch thinner, vibrating with hope and fear in equal measure. Laura spent the day in motion, unable to settle. She scrubbed the kitchen until her knuckles ached. She triple-checked the windows and doors, drawing the curtains, terrified someone would peer inside. Every sound from the road, an engine backfiring, tires crunching gravel, sent her heart into a sprint. She pictured the green Montana Fish and Wildlife trucks rolling up the driveway, imagined being forced to hand Scout over to strangers, imagined the mother's wild scream echoing through the woods as they tore her cub away. Late in the afternoon, Laura sat down at the old pine table, her face in her hands. She remembered every moment she'd spent with Scout, the impossible trust in his mother's eyes, the stubborn will to live that had defied the odds, the healing she'd felt inside herself as she'd cared for him. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. Sometimes, to save someone, you have to let them go. That was when Laura made her decision. She would not wait for someone to take Scout from her. She would give him back to the wild on her own terms, with as much dignity and love as she could offer. Maybe it was reckless, maybe it was selfish, but it felt truer than anything else in her life. She wrote a letter to Fish and Wildlife, explaining as best she could the circumstances that had brought a wild bobcat cub into her kitchen, the desperate choice she'd made, the trust the mother had shown. She wrote about the long nights, the fear and the hope, the silent bond that had grown between her and the wild. She asked for understanding, for time, for forgiveness. She asked that if Scout was seen in the area again, he be allowed to remain free. Laura left the letter folded on the table, weighted down by a mug, the only confession she could make in case someone came looking. As dusk approached, she prepared Scout for what might be their last journey together. She wrapped him in her softest flannel, placing him gently into a padded carrier, tucking in a rag that still carried her scent. She packed a small bowl of water, a last bottle of goat milk, and a handful of the wild grasses Scout had started nibbling. Every gesture was deliberate. Every movement, an act of love and heartbreak. Outside, the woods were silent, holding their breath. Laura stepped onto the porch, her eyes searching for the bobcat mother. She was there, of course she was, waiting in the hush beneath the trembling pines. Laura's boots crunched softly over the grass as she walked to the edge of the clearing. She set the carrier down and unzipped it, hands shaking. Scout peered out, blinking at the shifting shadows, nostrils flaring as he scented the wild air. For a moment, he hesitated, torn between the known warmth of the carrier and the vast, mysterious world beyond. Laura crouched beside him, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Be wild. Be safe," she whispered, her voice catching. "Your mom is waiting. You belong with her now." She pressed a trembling kiss to the top of his head, breathing in his scent one last time. Every memory flashed before her. Scout's first tremulous breath, his tiny paws kneading her shirt, the weight of him curled against her heart on the longest night. It was all she could do to stay upright, as grief and pride collided in her chest. The mother bobcat moved forward, as if sensing her child's approach. Her muscles rippled with tension and longing, her tail low and cautious. She made no sound, just a slow, wary step closer, eyes never leaving Laura's face. Laura gently nudged Scout forward. He took a faltering step, then another, drawn by the familiar shape and scent of his mother. She circled him, sniffed, then nuzzled his side, rumbling low in her throat. For a brief, shimmering moment, all three of them, woman, cub, wild mother, were joined in a silent circle of trust and loss. Then, with a final glance over his shoulder, Scout leaned into his mother's warmth. Laura backed away, hands pressed to her mouth to hold in the sob that threatened to break her in half. The wild mother melted into the shadows, Scout tucked against her side. Laura watched until the shapes vanished, swallowed by the living dark of the woods. She stood alone, every nerve raw, every emotion stripped bare. She had made the hardest choice, and in doing so, had honored the boundary between love and wildness, between what can be saved and what must be let go. As the stars blinked awake overhead, Laura whispered into the vast Montana night, "Thank you for trusting me. Thank you for letting me love him." And she walked back to the cabin, empty and whole in ways she hadn't thought possible. The woods stood silent as dusk settled in, painting the world with shades of indigo and copper. For Laura, time seemed suspended, each second stretching out as she lingered at the edge of the clearing where she'd left Scout and his mother just moments before. A strange mix of emptiness and relief pressed in on her chest. Grief braided with pride, hope twined with uncertainty. She wanted desperately to rush after them, to scoop Scout back into her arms, to start the whole impossible rescue over again. But the wild does not return what it accepts, and the night would not bargain with her sorrow. Laura knew this with every aching muscle in her body. She stood motionless, her breath fogging in the cooling air. Only the distant rush of wind in the pines and the faint ticking of her own heartbeat kept her anchored. The carrier, soft, flannel-lined, and still warm from Scout's tiny body, felt suddenly out of place, like a memory that belonged to someone else. In that liminal hour, Laura's senses sharpened. She became aware of everything: the shiver of aspen leaves, the musky scent of earth, the cautious footfalls of small creatures returning to their night work. She strained to hear something, anything, from the woods, but there was only the vast, enveloping hush. Laura sat on the porch steps, clutching the carrier to her chest. The letter to Fish and Wildlife waited on the table inside, silent testimony to her choice. She wondered if anyone would come, if they would understand the line she'd walked, the impossible decisions she'd faced. For now there was only the hush and the ache of absence. As darkness deepened, Laura's thoughts wandered to Scout's first night in her care. His ragged breathing, the tremor in his fragile body, the way he'd curled instinctively into her palm. She smiled, then caught herself, grief rising fast and sharp. She had known all along this day would come, but nothing could prepare her for the emptiness that filled the house. She made herself tea, but it tasted flat. She tried to read, but the words slid past her, meaningless. Every sound in the woods made her flinch. Each time her heart leapt with the wild hope that Scout or his mother might reappear, if only for a moment. The house seemed cavernous, every corner echoing with silence. It was well past midnight when Laura heard a sound at the edge of the yard, a soft rustle, almost too faint to notice. She moved to the window and peered into the dark. Two shapes appeared at the very edge of the porch light. The mother Bobcat, her muscles rippling with wariness, and beside her Scout, looking small and wild and impossibly alive. Laura didn't dare move, barely dared to breathe. The mother sat first, her ears pricked forward, her golden eyes locked on the house. Scout hovered near her side, caught between the world he'd left and the world he'd only just begun to know. In the brief, shimmering silence, Laura felt the boundary between them flicker, thin as a veil, heavy as a mountain. She pressed her hand to the glass, a silent goodbye, a wordless blessing. Scout's ears twitched. For a second, he looked directly at her. The wild mother brushed against him. Then the two of them turned and melted into the trees, shadows once again. Laura let out a long, shuddering breath. The porch and yard were empty, but her heart was suddenly full, not with regret, but with something deeper, harder to name. The next day, the sun rose bright and cold. Laura walked the wood's edge, searching for any sign of her little charge. She found only a single paw print in the soft earth, delicate and unmistakable. She crouched beside it, touched it with her fingers, and felt a pulse of joy. Scout was alive. Scout was wild. Life returned to its slow rhythm. The house was quieter, but Laura found herself listening, always listening, for the yowl of a bobcat, the rustle of paws in the brush. She filled her days with small chores, tending her vegetable patch, writing letters, watching the world shift from summer to fall. At night, she stood at the window, her eyes drawn to the place where the woods met the clearing, hoping for another glimpse, never quite expecting one. Sometimes when the loneliness crept in and old grief pressed down on her chest, Laura held Scout's flannel blanket or reread the note she'd written to the authorities. She let herself cry, let herself miss him, let herself remember the fragile bridge of trust she'd been allowed to cross. The memory of Scout's heartbeat, the weight of his small body in her hands, the silent company of the wild mother. These became her talismans, proof that connection was possible, even at the edge of what was safe or easy. Weeks passed. The woods grew gold and red. Laura spotted deer in the dawn mist, watched hawks wheel overhead, and learned the sounds of the forest in every season. Sometimes on the edge of sleep, she dreamed of Scout running free, the wild mother at his side. One evening, as the world blushed with sunset, Laura heard the faintest echo of a yowl, distant, proud, untamed. She stepped onto the porch and looked to the tree line. For just a moment, she thought she saw two shapes there, a mother and her grown cub, watching, remembering. The wild, she realized, had given her not just a story to tell, but a wound that would heal into something fierce and beautiful, a scar shaped like hope. She stood quietly as the night fell, her heart both broken and mended. In the deep hush that followed, Laura knew she would never forget what it felt like to let go, and to trust that somehow love would find its way back home. The days that followed felt strangely hollow, as if the air itself had changed weight. Laura drifted from room to room in the quiet cabin, her movements slow and thoughtful, haunted by the absence that pressed against every surface. With Scout and his mother gone, the house echoed with memories, every soft mew, every hopeful glance at the door. Every night she'd held her breath listening for a heartbeat. There were times she reached instinctively for the soft flannel on the counter, expecting to find a warm bundle curled atop it, only to remember that her arms were empty. She tried to fill the hours with chores. She chopped kindling and stacked firewood for the coming Montana winter. She weeded the vegetable patch behind the house, turning the soil and watching worms wriggle beneath her gloved hands. She wrote letters, never quite sending them, to old friends back in Seattle, trying to explain what had changed in her, but lacking the words for it. When she finally sat still, she listened for sounds in the woods. Every creak, every flutter, every sigh in the trees made her heart leap in anticipation before fading again into silence. Regret, sharp and insistent, began to gnaw at her. Did I do the right thing? The question became a refrain, as persistent as the wind whistling through the pines. Some nights she replayed every decision, every moment of hesitation. Should she have called Fish and Wildlife sooner, despite the risk? Was she arrogant to believe she could bridge the gap between wild and human, even for a heartbeat? Was her love a kindness, or just another human interference in nature's order? The questions were relentless. Yet, beneath the doubt, another feeling had begun to bloom, a quiet transformation. In caring for Scout and honoring his wild mother's trust, Laura had felt something mend inside herself. It was as though every moment spent at the edge of hope and heartbreak had carved out a space for something new. Resilience, maybe, or grace. The pain of letting go lingered, but it had changed shape, becoming less like a wound and more like a scar. A reminder of what she was capable of, even when she thought she had nothing left to give. The woods themselves seemed changed too. Without Scout's soft cries or the mother's watchful eyes at the tree line, the landscape was emptier, the absence heavy and unmistakable. Laura walked the perimeter of the clearing each morning, her boots leaving tracks in the dew. She followed game trails through the brush, searching for any sign, paw prints in the soft earth, tufts of fur caught on brambles, the faintest imprint of a wildlife continuing just out of reach. She found nothing, day after day, and with each passing week her hope began to wane. One morning, late in October, Laura rose before sunrise and brewed coffee she didn't really want. The sky outside was a sheet of cold gray, clouds heavy with the promise of snow. She wandered to the porch, mug in hand, breath curling in the chill. Her mind was still foggy with sleep, heavy with longing. That was when she saw it. A single clear paw print in the soft mud at the base of the steps. She blinked, not trusting her eyes. The print was small, but unmistakably wild, the toes splayed, the claws sharp. Laura crouched and reached out, her fingers trembling as she traced the shape. It was real. It was fresh. A tremor of hope surged through her, fragile and fierce. She looked to the tree line, scanning for movement, for any flash of tawny fur. Nothing but the shifting light between trees. Yet the print remained. Proof that the wild had not disappeared. That Scout, her little fighter, had survived the return to his world. That night, Laura sat in the living room with the flannel blanket folded beside her. She found herself talking aloud, as if to Scout or his mother, or perhaps to the woods themselves. I hope you're safe out there. I hope you remember me. Just a little. She smiled at her own foolishness. Maybe the wild remembered. Maybe it didn't. What mattered was that she remembered, that she had been part of something larger than herself, if only for a moment. She left the porch light on that evening, a small, silent beacon. And just before midnight, when she returned to the window, she saw two shadows at the edge of the trees, low and quiet, their outlines blurred by distance and darkness. Her breath caught in her throat. Scout and his mother, side by side, watching from the boundary of wild and human, just as they had so many nights before. The moment lasted only seconds, but it was enough. The wild, in its way, had come back, not to stay, but to let her know that trust, once given, was never truly lost. The next morning, Laura woke lighter than she had in weeks. She cleaned the kitchen with a gentle smile, humming the lullaby she'd sung to Scout in the sleepless nights. She made a copy of the paw print with her phone and pinned it above her desk, beside the letter she'd written to Fish and Wildlife and a small tuft of Scout's fur, saved from the first bath she'd given him. As autumn slid toward winter, Laura's heart held the weight of absence but also the gift of connection. She still walked the woods every morning, still listened for the wild at dusk. But now, when she reached the edge of the trees, she stood quietly, simply grateful for what had been given, and for what might still return, if only for a moment. Autumn waned, and the woods beyond Laura's cabin turned to fire, maples, aspens, and birch shedding their golden leaves, carpeting the earth with memory. Each day, Laura grew a little more comfortable with the silence, no longer an emptiness, but a space in which the lessons of her wild visitors could settle and take root. She began to write, at first just for herself. Late at night, she'd sit at the kitchen table, the lamplight pooling over her notebook, and spill out the story in fits and starts. She wrote about that first haunting cry in the twilight, about the wild mother's impossible trust, about the trembling, battered cub who'd changed everything. She wrote about fear and loneliness and hope, about how saving Scout was never really about rescue alone, but about stepping to the very edge of what she understood and letting herself be changed. Did I rescue Scout? Or did he rescue me? The question echoed, page after page, as Laura sifted through every detail, every moment of doubt or grace. She saw now how she had arrived in Montana grieving and hollowed out, believing her heart might never open again. She remembered her mother's illness, the endless string of hospital nights, the way loss could make the world small and tight around the edges. But the wild, Scout, his mother, the silent, waiting woods, had gently, insistently reminded her that connection was always possible, even if it hurt. Sometimes late at night, Laura scrolled through old photos she'd taken. Scout's paw curled around her finger, the mother bobcat's golden eyes reflected in the porch light, the sunrise painting the trees on the morning she'd let them go. She shared a few images, and then her story, in an online group for wildlife and nature lovers. She was surprised when, within days, hundreds of people responded. Some cheered her on, praising her compassion and bravery. Others questioned her choices, debating the ethics of intervention versus letting nature run its course. There were heated comments, wild with opinion, and quiet notes of thanks from strangers who had faced similar impossible decisions. The story traveled further than Laura expected. Soon her inbox filled with questions. Would you do it again? Did you ever see Scout after that last night? Do you think wild animals can trust people? The conversations turned in circles. When do you help, and when do you let go? can a line ever truly be drawn between wild and tame, between compassion and interference? What do we owe the creatures who share our world? Laura tried to answer honestly. She wrote, "I'm no expert. I can only say that sometimes trust is the bravest thing, on both sides. The wild doesn't owe us anything, but sometimes it reaches out. And if you're lucky enough to be there, you just have to do your best, knowing it might never be enough." The debate was ongoing, but for Laura, some truths had grown clearer. She realized that true connection doesn't always need words or rules. Sometimes it lives in the quiet, in the act of waiting, in respecting the wildness in another being, and in yourself. Sometimes helping means holding on. Sometimes it means letting go. She began to talk more openly about her experience, first in the community center at the edge of town, then at a meeting of the local wildlife group. She described the night-long vigils, the fear of being discovered, the moment of impossible trust at the tree line. She shared her doubts, her mistakes, her gratitude. Others spoke up too. Ranchers who'd nursed orphaned deer, hikers who'd cradled wounded birds, neighbors who'd left food for stray foxes despite the warnings. It became clear that Laura's story was not unique. All around her, people were wrestling with the thin line between helping and harming, with the risks and responsibilities of living so close to the wild. There were no easy answers, but there was a kind of comfort in the conversation itself. A recognition that empathy, even when it's messy or flawed, is a vital part of what it means to be human. One evening, after sharing her story with a small group, Laura walked home through the chilly twilight. She paused at the edge of the woods, listening to the chorus of crickets and the rustle of dry leaves. The wild felt both nearer and more mysterious than ever, a world with its own rules, its own pain and beauty, its own language of trust. She realized that what she had experienced wasn't just about Scout or his mother, or even her own healing. It was about the courage to stand at the boundary between worlds and reach out, not knowing if your hand will be bitten or blessed. It was about learning to sit in the discomfort of uncertainty, to love something you might lose, to find meaning even in a fleeting encounter. Laura stood in the dark, her heart beating quietly, and understood at last. Sometimes the wild rescues you. Sometimes the lesson is not in saving, but in being willing to be changed by the saving. The mark Scout and his mother left on her life was as real as the paw print she'd found by her porch, a sign that trust, once given, changes both the giver and the receiver forever. That autumn, as the leaves drifted down and the first flakes of snow began to fall, Laura kept her window cracked open at night, just enough to hear the wild, should it call again. She slept with Scout's blanket folded on the bed beside her and a photo of a single paw print pinned to the wall. A reminder that what is wild in the world, and in ourselves, is not something to be feared, but something to be cherished. And sometimes, she whispered into the darkness, "Thank you," unsure if the words would ever reach their intended audience, but grateful for the chance to say them all the same. Winter in Montana settled with its usual quiet insistence, blanketing the world in white and softening even the hardest edges. Laura's days became rituals of small comforts, lighting the wood stove at dawn, watching blue jays fight over the feeder, clearing the path to the mailbox beneath the heavy hush of falling snow. Some evenings, she'd sit by the window with a mug of tea, the warmth soaking into her hands as she gazed out at the pale, sleeping woods. There were no bobcat tracks now, only the looping lines of rabbits and the heavy stride of a lone deer. The wild had retreated deeper, but the memory of it lingered, as vivid as any living thing. She kept Scout's flannel blanket folded on her nightstand, and beside it, a photo of the fresh paw print she'd found after his return. Sometimes, in the pale morning light, she would touch both, a silent thank you, a way of grounding herself in all that had passed. Life was quieter now, but not empty. The absence she'd felt after letting Scout go had shifted. It became something solid, a presence in itself, a bittersweet gratitude for what she'd been allowed to witness, a pride that she had done the right thing, no matter how it hurt. As the cold months drew on, Laura returned to her nursing routines at a local clinic, bringing with her a new steadiness that her colleagues noticed but didn't press her to explain. She listened more, comforted patients with a gentle patience she hadn't possessed before. Something about living at the edge of the wild, about watching Scout and his mother fight for each other, had given her a kind of quiet strength. She found herself telling small parts of the story to those who needed it most. The lonely, the grieving, the ones feeling lost at the edge of their own darkness. She spoke of trust, of unlikely hope, of how the wild can heal us in ways we never expect. Then, in the first weeks of spring, when the last crusts of snow finally melted and the grass returned in shy patches, Laura made a habit of rising early. She'd sit on her porch in an old flannel shirt, mug in hand, and watch the woods wake up. There was peace in the waiting, in not knowing what the day would bring. Sometimes bluebirds trilled in the high branches, and sometimes, rarely, she caught the flash of tawny fur moving at the very edge of her vision, gone before she could even be sure. She didn't need Scout or his mother to return for the story to feel complete. But she always hoped, just a little, every time the dusk turned the yard to shadow and the forest to gold. It was a hope without demand, a patient, humble wish, a thankfulness for whatever wild grace might brush against her life, even for a moment. Inside, Laura built a small shelf above the kitchen table. On it, she kept a few relics from the past year. The paw print photo, Scout's flannel, her mother's old stethoscope, a feather she'd found near the clearing. They were not trophies, but reminders of loss, yes, but also of the invisible threads that connect us, if we have the courage to notice them. She thought often of the line between worlds, the wild and the tame, the past and the future, heartbreak and healing. She understood now that the bridge was always there, waiting. It asked only for a moment of trust. One afternoon, a letter arrived from Montana Fish and Wildlife. Laura opened it with trembling hands, steeling herself for admonishment or regret. But inside was a brief, gentle note. "Thank you for your honesty, Miss Miller. It's not always easy to do what you did. We hope the wild repaid your kindness in its own way." She set the letter beside Scout's blanket, her chest tight with relief and a sense of closure. Spring moved gently through the valley. The woods softened, buds swelling on the aspens and willows. Laura planted new flowers near the porch and let the wind carry her old fears away. Some evenings, she would find herself standing at the edge of the yard as the sun sank low, listening for the call of an owl, the distant yowl of a bobcat, the secret language of the wild that she had learned to hear. In time, the ache in her heart became something else, a quiet pride, a knowledge that she had been a part of a miracle, no matter how small or fleeting. She realized the wild didn't owe her anything. If it trusted her, even for a heartbeat, it was a gift beyond measure. That trust had changed her. It had shown her that connection is possible at the most unlikely edges of life, and that letting go can be an act of the deepest love. The seasons turned. On a golden evening in late April, Laura sat on the steps of her cabin, the sky painted in stripes of lavender and rose. The woods at the edge of her property shimmered in the half-light. For a brief, astonishing moment, two shapes appeared. one large and sure-footed, the other smaller, trailing behind. She couldn't be certain, but her heart leaped all the same. They paused, almost as if to acknowledge her, then slipped back into the trees. A bridge between worlds, never fully seen, but never truly gone. Laura sat quietly, feeling the deep hush settle around her. She understood finally what she'd learned from Scout and his mother. The wild changes us, leaves us marked in ways no one else can see. It reminds us to trust ourselves, each other, the unknown paths that wait in every life. As the first stars bloomed overhead, Laura whispered, "Thank you." She held the silence, feeling it echo inside her, a miracle folded quietly into her days. And at the edge of the wild, beneath the watching sky, she felt whole again, forever changed by a fleeting trust, a bridge between worlds, and a love that needed no words.